Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're totally dismantling the myth that building wealth requires some crazy stroke of luck, a massive inheritance, or, being a Wall Street genius. Instead, we're going to look at a mathematically proven roadmap to financial freedom. And the absolute best part, this is a framework anyone can follow. Even if you've got zero formal financial education, you do not need a finance degree to secure your future. You just need to understand the basic machinery. So let's just dive right into this really powerful quote from our source material, because it completely shifts how we need to think about getting rich. We always hear these wild stories about lucky stock picks or, overnight entrepreneurial successes. But the dull, quiet truth, the vast majority of long-term financial security is built simply by getting the everyday mechanics right. Which, naturally, begs the question. If wealth isn't about inheritances or magically guessing the next big tech stock, what is the actual machine we need to build here to guarantee our financial security? Well, here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with Engine 1, saving, then move to Engine 2, investing, and Engine 3, compounding. After that, we'll talk about putting it all together and wrap up by avoiding some really common money mistakes. All right, starting off with Engine 1, saving. This is the fuel that starts everything. Now, saving is definitely the least glamorous step, but look at the sheer power of this fuel. Let's look at Alex and Jordan. They both earn the exact same income, $60,000 a year. But Jordan actually has the restraint to save 20% of her income, while Alex saves just 5%. Fast forward 10 years of simply stashing money away, Alex has $30,000 and Jordan has $120,000. That massive $90,000 gap, it's purely mathematical. It has absolutely nothing to do with talent, luck, or background. It's entirely about that savings rate. The crucial point here is that saving creates what the financial world calls a corpus. But for the rest of us, just think of it as the snowball you need to pack together before you can actually roll it down the hill. Without a starting pile of money to put to work, you literally have nothing. Think about it. A 20% annual return on $0 is, still just $0. You've got to build that initial pile. But, saving definitely has a ceiling. If Jordan just stuffs her $12,000 a year into a mattress, which, let's be real, would get pretty lumpy, or into a checking account getting basically zero return for 30 years, she maxes out at $360,000. That's a highly respectable sum for sure, but it's also the absolute maximum that saving alone can produce. To go further and truly build wealth, we desperately need our next engine. And that brings us to Engine 2, investing. This is all about making your money work for you. Now, we really have to watch out for this silent threat of inflation. Historically, it runs around 3% per year in the US. It's basically a silent tax on your savings. Every single dollar you leave idle loses a little bit of its purchasing power every single year. Meaning, if you're saving without investing, you are quite literally running just to stand still. Your money is slowly bleeding value. Investing, however, changes this arithmetic completely. By deploying her capital into a diversified index fund, which, if you're unfamiliar, is basically just a single basket holding tiny pieces of hundreds of top companies and earning a very reasonable 7% annually after inflation, Jordan turns that $360,000 ceiling into a massive $1.13 million over 30 years. That extra $770,000? It didn't come from her sweating more hours at her job. It came entirely from the returns on the capital she had already accumulated. Now, of course, investing does introduce real risk. We all remember the terrifying market drops of 2008 or that crazy pandemic crash in 2020. But the real secret here is holding your ground. Investors who panicked and sold at the absolute bottom, they converted temporary paper losses into permanent real losses. Risk tolerance is simply the financial skill of never doing that. It's knowing the difference between a bumpy ride and an actual crash. Which leads us to our turbocharger. Engine 3, compounding, the force that does the heavy lifting. When you consider a $10,000 investment over time, you can clearly see the growth is not a straight line. Returns actually generate their own returns. It bends the curve so sharply upward that in the final decade between year 30 and year 40, the portfolio adds over $74,000. That is more than 7 times the original investment added in a single decade without putting in a single extra dollar. It seems kind of trivial at first, but it becomes completely massive later on. And this brings us to a frankly staggering realization about the cost of waiting. Let's look at Emma and Noah. Emma invested $5,000 a year for only 10 years, and then she completely stopped. Total contribution, $50,000. Noah, on the other hand, started a decade later, invested for 30 straight years, and put in 3 times as much money as Emma. Yet, at age 65, Emma is richer. She ends up with over $600,000, compared to Noah's $472,000.
All right, moving on to putting it all together. Let's look at running all 3 engines simultaneously.
Imagine a 25-year-old named Marcus. He saves and invests $12,000 a year into a diversified portfolio. If he does this consistently for 40 years, he ends up with over $2.5 million. But if he procrastinates and starts just 10 years later at age 35, his final portfolio shrinks to about $1.13 million. So that single lost decade doesn't just cost him his missed contributions. It costs him a breathtaking $1.43 million in final wealth. That right there is the true price of procrastination. But hey, here is exactly why this machinery is so deeply empowering for absolutely everyone. You do not need a Wall Street salary to make this work. Just $200 a month, which is less than $7 a day, basically a fancy coffee, starting at age 22, turns into over $500,000 by retirement. Your total out-of-pocket contributions are under $100,000, but compounding adds over $400,000 to your pile. It is incredibly accessible. Finally, let's talk about avoiding common money mistakes so you don't short-circuit the machinery.
Okay, high fees are an absolute silent killer. The gap between a high-cost active fund where you're paying an expert to try and guess the market and a low-cost index fund charging almost nothing, well, it might sound trivial, but over 30 years on a $1 million portfolio, that tiny percentage difference will cost you roughly $430,000 in foregone growth. Those are returns eaten by fees before compounding can even touch them. No way do you want to lose out on that.
Beyond ignoring fees and taxes, the other major traps are incredibly common. First up, confusing income with wealth. A high earner who spends everything is not wealthy. They are literally just financing a high-end lifestyle. Second, interrupting the cycle. Panic selling or pulling money out early completely resets your compounding clock. And finally, mistaking complexity for sophistication. You really do not need expensive financial advisors or super complex trading strategies to win. A simple, low-cost index fund held for decades will almost always outperform the fancy, expensive alternatives.
Ultimately, the one insight that separates those who actually build wealth from those who merely earn an income is the understanding that time is not the enemy. It is your most indispensable ingredient. This machine works if you just give it the runway it needs. The math is undeniable, which leaves us with one final vital question. You now have the user manual, so when are you going to start your engines?